Welcome everyone, episode 24 of the AMR Origin series. Once again, my name's Greg Fisher, hosting this series on behalf of all my editor and associate editor colleagues at the Academy of Management Review. And I'm joined today by Matt Hersel. Matt is an assistant professor at Clemson University, and he's going to be talking to us about his paper entitled Fighting with the Fourth Estate, a theoretical framework of organization, media rivalry for narrative control following a transgression. So Matt, thanks for being here. Thanks for being willing to join us. Can you give us the sort of brief 1-minute elevator pitch or headline description of what this paper is about?
Yeah, of course. And thanks for having me. Really enjoyed this series and happy to participate. So first and foremost, at least for me in writing this paper, and I'm not sure it's really the primary theoretical contribution, but it was the most important part of it for me. It was about reframing organizations and the news media as potential rivals. And so, kind of at the core of this reconceptualization and reframing is the idea that these two entities, under certain circumstances, compete with one another to control the narrative that's presented to the public about, an organization's transgression. And so, in that reframing and reconceptualization, I, build some theory about, kind of how and why they're behaving towards one another. And that kind of encapsulates the main goal for me in writing the paper. Now, I think also the article makes some, solid contributions to competitive dynamics on the theory side, which is certainly the theoretical frame of the article, especially in terms of how and why rivalries emerge and play out between dissimilar actors. And by that, I mean two parties that aren't rivals in the traditional sense. They don't share, some common market share that they're competing over, or some finite resources in the value chain that they're fighting to gain more of. And then kind of, kind of as a last, theoretical contribution or primary theoretical contribution on the competitive dynamic side, I think it brings communicative or rhetorical types of competitive actions and reactions to the fore, and kind of build some theory about the role of those tactics in competition.
So rivalry over narrative. How did you come to that? What was sort of the spark behind exploring the competition or rivalry between organizations and media players as they try and control the narrative? Where did you come up with the idea?
Yeah, I think it was, complete happenstance. It was definitely not something that was fully planned out when I started writing the manuscript. And I think it's kind of a funny story, actually. So when I started on this, it was, or when the idea started, percolating, there were a lot of topical examples happening. And I draw on a lot of topical examples in the manuscript. Some of them were the ones that inspired the idea. But it was, it was during the time of kind of like the lead up to the 2020 presidential election here in the States. And I think, most folks familiar with the Trump campaign treating media entities as the enemy, treating them in a very rivalrous sort of fashion. And I think it went both ways there. And so that, along with, so when I just started at Clemson at the time, and I was trying to really familiarize myself with some of my colleagues' work, and Ted Waldron, who doesn't work at Clemson, but published a paper with Chad and Navis, and Olivia Warrenson, Jeffrey York, Desiree Pacheco, right as I got there, about, the idea of values-based rivalry between organizations and activists. And I know that's something that you've published some work on too. But yeah, I was actually reading that paper, trying to kind of like brush up on Chad's work, trying to find ways that we could work together. ended up not working together on this, but after kind of like diving into that paper, the connection started to click between, that theory development and what I was seeing, in reality.
So you bring up the example of sort of the Trump campaign and the efforts of the parties in that campaign fighting with CNN and fighting with whoever else. But it's not actually one of the examples you reference in the paper, but you do have, and you do make use of very salient examples in the paper. So to share with us a few of those examples just to help us further concretize this idea of media organization rivalry, and then maybe share a little bit of a story about how you uncovered and sort of gathered enough information about these examples to be able to draw them in such an interesting and relevant way.
Sure. Yeah, very kind of you to say that. But yeah, I would say one of the primary examples that I include in the manuscript is one of Frederick Smith kind of going toe-to-toe with FedEx. So I included a press release that FedEx released where he basically goes after the New York Times for an article that they wrote that was critical of FedEx's lobbying expenditures. And he goes after them in a really pointed and kind of malicious way. And so anyway, that was one of the really topical examples that came to me as I was beginning writing the manuscript. And I remember taking that press release and showing it to some of my good friends here in Greenville at a dinner party and talking about kind of like the generalities of the idea, and it like lit up the dinner table. And so I knew I was onto something there, that, a group of, real estate developers, athletes, folks like that aren't in our field found it really interesting. But yeah, from there, I sampled what I think is a really cool sample of media articles to try to really kind of solidify my ideas as I started this project. And those were Pulitzer Prize winning articles about organizational transgressions. And so those span, of course, in the article, I broadened the term organization out beyond corporate entities to include, governmental activist organizations, everything like that. And so I just dove into those Pulitzer Prize winning stories. Many of them were, 3 article series or, up to 20 article series, very well-known stories. And, just a treasure trove of information to kind of be able to build out the first stage of the model.
So Pulitzer Prize winning journalism often, not always, but quite often is associated with the reporting of an organizational transgression, which is sort of part of your key insight here. And then, so you go to those Pulitzer Prize winning stories, capture those that have got an organizational transgression in them, and are able to utilize those to bring your theorizing to life, to make it salient, and that includes sort of reporting on Walmart, reporting on natural gas companies in Virginia, reporting on the National Security Administration, all of those really sort of examples that as general public we know pretty well, but then you delve down. And one of the things I found interesting about this paper is it's really a manuscript that, we talk at AMR about different ways of writing an AMR paper. And one of the ways of writing an AMR paper is to integrate 2 largely disconnected literatures. And I think that's essentially what you do here. You're coming at it from a theoretical stance with all these interesting examples, but the theory is derived by integrating 2 different literatures. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about which literatures those are, and what was your process for sort of uncovering and understanding each literature such that you could bring them together in a novel way?
Yeah, sure. And you're absolutely right in terms of the theory development process. I know AMR has some great author resources, and one of those is a video that kind of outlines the 3, primary ways of developing theory. and certainly referenced that as I was developing the manuscript. But yeah, so most of my research prior to this paper was in the crisis management area. I had published an Annals piece on corrective actions that organizations pursue after misconduct. And so that was really what I was, gearing myself up for in the future. And is certainly still my primary research focus. And then, again, kind of happenstance and lucky that, I was pushed towards that paper, that Waldron et al. Paper in AMR about, these different types of dissimilar rivalries. And again, I'm not sure, but I believe at that point, really the only type of dissimilar rivalry that had been examined in any depth was activists versus firms. And so I saw it as a real opportunity to kind of build that idea and that theory out further. And this kind of dissimilar rivals movement and competitive dynamics, I think, has a lot of potential. In terms of the different types of rivalries that we can look at and what that might tell us about how competition works in general. So that was kind of, the meshing of that in my mind. And really, I just explored it as I developed the paper.
So did you do anything to sort of get up to speed on the competitive dynamics literature? Because you were obviously coming more from the transgression and crisis management side of things, and you had to become familiar enough with and grounded enough in the competitive dynamics literature to be able to use it as a mechanism to create new theory. Was it just reading? Did you do anything else to get yourself up to speed? Just for the purpose of people who are trying to, develop new theory and have to go and delve into a new literature, a new theoretical domain that maybe they haven't been so familiar with, yet they want to use it as a basis for an AMR paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, tons of reading. I mean, I was definitely familiar with the competitive dynamics literature in general because my advisor works in that area to some degree. But yeah, I never used it in my research. So tons of reading, and really, I think that Waldron paper did a great job of kind of laying out most of what I needed to develop theory about dissimilar rivals. Now, I think it's probably worth saying, and this as well as anyone, but the first version of an AMR manuscript is nothing like the final version, and I definitely credit the reviewers and the editor on helping guide me towards the theoretical contributions that I made in the competitive dynamics literature. I would say the original version of the manuscript was much more heavily focused on crisis management, probably to the detriment of the paper, which is why they pushed me in the direction they did, and I think improved it quite a bit.
That's interesting because it definitely doesn't come across like that in the final reading of it. I actually, because I had never met you and didn't know you, when I was reading it for the first time, I thought, oh, this is a crisis. I mean, this is a competitive dynamics researcher who's found intrigue and interest in bringing in the sort of crisis management stuff. And so it had almost completely flipped in terms of how it comes across.
Yeah, and credit to the reviewers and the editor in helping me pull that off. I'm really happy to contribute to that area, and I really think that the work that Ted's doing and a couple other folks are doing, and the dissimilar rivalries area and competitive dynamics is super interesting, and I plan on pursuing work in that area further. I have some current work in that area, but yeah, it's definitely not the focus that I had from the outset.
So let's talk to us a little bit about the essence of the theory of this paper. So it's a multi-stage model, and I've pulled it up on the screen so anyone who's watching can actually, as Matt talks, sort of visualize some of the stuff he's talking about. It's a multi-stage model. Can you just talk us through, what precedes the sort of focus area of this model? What's going on in each of these two stages? And then what's the sort of outcome that you theorize from all of this? So the title of the figure is a multi-stage conceptual model of organization media rivalry for narrative control following a transgression, which ties very nicely into the title of the paper.
Yeah, and actually, before I jump into that, I think it's probably worth mentioning, the AMR, kind of support for authors or guide for authors in terms of theory development. I can't remember off the top of my head what all three of the theory development mechanisms are, but two of them are process and typology, or no, process.
Yeah,
typology.
so you're right. There's propositional theorizing,
Yeah.
then narrative or procedural style theorizing, and then typology. And it's evident that you've sort of understood each of those and incorporated elements of each into what you've done.
Right, I threw all of those against the wall. So in the paper, there are also propositions, but here we have a process and some level of typology in each stage. So basically, in terms of the theory, the idea is that when a transgression occurs, it kind of triggers these latent rivalries that exist between media outlets and the organization that transgressed. It's like the media always kind of has this tension or desire to cover organizational transgressions for a few different reasons, kind of related to the nature of news media as an institution. Number one, and in terms of stage one, here's where I'm getting into. Number one, these media outlets are businesses. Of course, if they can draw attention or draw readers or viewers' attention to themselves, it's a good thing for the media outlet. And so the idea behind scandalousness is that, if they can scandalize something to generate attention, then that meets their business needs. The second point is misinformation, and here's where I'm really kind of honing in on kind of the altruistic view of the media that they are trying to uncover the truth and present it to their audience, and that's kind of could also be a motivator in these situations as well, to try to engage with an organization that's committed a transgression. And then the last is transgressor susceptibility, and this is really more keyed in on the idea that media organizations and the journalists in them are human beings with biases and political goals and orientation. And so if they see the possibility of promoting some type of pro-social change in their view in these organizations, then they may be duly motivated to engage in critical coverage of the organization and its transgression. And
so stage one really focuses on the journalist and the likelihood that a journalist is going to pick up on something that an organization has done and invest the time in reporting that and making sure that reporting's right. And that's going to be driven by whether they think it's scandalous, because that's going to drive business, whether they reflect on their sort of role as journalists in resolving misinformation or reporting the truth, essentially, and the likelihood that they can actually drive some level of change or see themselves as having the potential to drive change. Is that fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely correct. And I would say that any one of these, at least in terms of how I think about them, would be sufficient to drive that coverage. Of course, all three on top of each other, I think, would also be a fantastic reason for a journalist to want to cover an organization's transgression. I just don't develop any propositions about that in the paper.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then stage two, you shift from the journalist's motivation to engage in this type of narrative rivalry or rivalry over narrative to the organizational leaders' sort of response to that, and so talk us through that, because this gets even a little more complicated than just the 3 points underlying the journalist's perception.
Yeah, and this was actually really difficult theory to make work, basically, and huge credit to the editor and reviewers for helping me with this. but yeah, so basically, looking at two qualities of the situation, basically. So the severity of the transgression, and really the primary argument there is like in the mind of the manager, of course, very likely knowing more than what the journalist or the public know about the situation. Do they think what they've done is a really bad thing? Is it severe to the extent that it could, if made public, delegitimize the organization? And so that's kind of a judgment on the part of the manager, and then the next is also a judgment. This stage 2 is happening, of course, after stage 1, where a media outlet has reported on the transgression. And here what the manager is looking at is the effect that the media coverage has had on the narrative about the transgression. Does the public accept what the media outlet or media outlets are saying? And how does that impact the threat of delegitimization? And so you can see, obviously the top right corner there is kind of the worst case scenario. There's an imminent threat of delegitimization. And the theory that I developed is that when this is the case, managers are highly likely to engage in some type of conciliatory rhetorical strategy. And by that, I mean accepting that we did something wrong and we're going to do something to fix it. On the diagonal there, we see, two situations where, something is going bad in the mind of the manager, but they think that they have a way out. And in those cases, I've conceptualize it as a potential threat of delegitimization, and they engage in some type of defensive rhetorical strategy, so like denial, or something along those lines.
Trying to reframe it in some way, which I think to some extent is what Fred Smith was trying to do in the FedEx example that you mentioned earlier. Trying to claim control of that narrative as opposed to just sort of admitting wrong and trying to move along.
Yeah, it's funny. Fred Smith in that example, it's almost like he opened a copy of Combs and Holliday's crisis management book and flipped to the defensive strategy section and then went down the laundry list and did all of them. He attacked the accuser. He did all kinds of things. But yeah, so anyway, and then in the last quadrant, we see that, in the manager's mind, there's really nothing that they've done wrong, and the media isn't having any kind of effect on public perception, and so they just ignore it, is what the most likely response is.
And then you've got an arrow back to stage 1. So, sort of the choice set for the leader, and you purposefully use the word leader as opposed to manager because your theorizing is that this can apply to for-profit firms, but it can also apply to other organizations. And you've got examples of those like the NSA. And so I thought that was smart, and it sort of broadened the scope of the theory to some extent. But then so from that stage 2, where the leader is interpreting what's going on, there is the potential for this cycle back to stage 1. What's the sort of thinking around that and the underlying logic of that sort of feedback loop?
Yeah, and so I can dive into the logic in a second, but I think the motivation for it was just looking at real life examples of this happening, where we often see these instances where there's kind of this back and forth, this punch and counter punch of media, negative reporting by the media, the organization making some response, more information coming out from the media, and then this cycle continues. And so as the manuscript evolved, it became obvious that one of the potential theoretical contributions for this to competitive dynamics was to kind of explore when these rivalries between dissimilar actors start, why they continue, and then when they terminate. It was something that hadn't really been fully explored anyway in the previous papers on these types of rivalries. And so yeah, the logic is basically that once the organization kind of has a chance to respond or not respond, then we're back to the media outlet to decide, based on, again, on these characteristics or the journalist's updated perceptions of these 3 things, are they going to re-engage or not? And so then, of course, if they do, then we have to go through this process in the leader's mind again. And then eventually, when both parties decide that, you know, it's not worth pursuing anymore, we get this termination. And so that's a little bit unique in terms of the competitive dynamics, especially with regard to dissimilar actors or dissimilar rivals. The assumption was always that, you know, especially when it comes to organizations versus activist groups, that one would achieve supremacy and then that would kind of be the end of the rivalry. And so here I reel that back a little bit and say, well, it's probably not necessarily, it's not necessarily about supremacy. It's really about kind of these factors that motivate the actors to continue to engage or not.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I think it's a very useful model. It helps really understand and convey what you've theorized, and reflects to some extent just the value of being able to see what you're writing and write what you're seeing as part of the process of writing a conceptual paper. And I want to pivot to that a little bit because you know, you're an assistant professor. You didn't graduate from your PhD program that long ago, and yet here you've got a single authored AMR paper that you've managed to get through. So, and
look, Greg, I'm as surprised as you.
Well, it's a great paper. It's extremely well written, very, very clear. And I know, I can tell by your demeanor, you're going to credit the reviewers and credit everyone else that you can for that. But in the end, it's your name on the paper. So I'd love to know just a little bit about what you have learned through the process of, number one, developing the idea, number two, submitting and having to refine and rework it, and number three, by sort of closing the deal, if you will, and sort of closing it out. What is there a few little things that you sort of, if you had a, you know, fourth or fifth year PhD student coming to you now and they say, you know, I think I've got something here. I want to try and write a conceptual paper. What would be some of the interesting or valuable things that you've taken from the process that you might tell them?
Yeah. Well, I would first say I'm sure there's a lot of luck involved. I think it was super lucky that I got Joel Baum, who you know, doesn't know me from Adam, as the editor for my paper. He, you know, received it warmly, I think, and then the reviewers as well. The review process was not easy by any means. There was a lot of critical comments, but always very constructive, and I felt like they always gave me something that I could use. You know, with the many comments that I received from them.
I'll tell you my perspective as an editor, just in response to that sort of reflection, because, you know, pulling back the editor's curtain a little bit, sure, is that as an associate editor, if there's a core good idea, something that's novel, that's interesting, and builds on an existing conversation, I think that's an incredibly valuable place to start. So in the case of this paper, there is this little branch out from the traditional competitive dynamics, which is firms versus firms, into activists versus firms. And so there's that as a conversation you can join. But then this whole idea of suddenly media organizations playing a part in this, and this control over narrative is new. So there's sort of this optimal distinctiveness. There's enough to build on and a good and strong enough conversation to join, but enough that's different about the essence of the idea. And I think that's incredibly valuable here in terms of the fact that you were actually building on something, but there is newness and novelty to this idea. And then the second piece to that I think helps or prompts an editor to say, let's give this a chance, or prompts the reviewers and the editor to say, let's give this a chance, is that there are very compelling contemporary examples. It's not like this is theorizing outside of reality. You can pick up the paper almost any day of the week and you can see examples of this at play. You go to some of the most salient examples, but the fact that there are these compelling examples is you're not theorizing for theorizing's sake. You're theorizing sort of what's a phenomenon that's happening in reality. So I think those two things are probably what, at least in the reviewers and in the editor's mind, said, well, you know, maybe it's not perfect first round, but there's something to work with here.
Yeah, and see, I think that's why you're the editor, Greg, because you put it far more eloquently than I could there. But yeah, I agree completely. If I were to guess, I would say that, you know, drawing on kind of like that unique novel set of examples, being Pulitzer Prize winning articles about organizational transgressions, gave me such a rich, you know, kind of environment to work in and building the theory. And that was something that was in the original submission. You know, I think where I failed and where the reviewers were able to push me kind of in a direction was that I had that as a base, and they said, you know, here's what, you know, when we were looking at these examples that you provided, even in this table, which didn't change much over the, at least the table describing the examples didn't change much over the course of the different submissions. But they said, you know, here's what we were hoping to see, here's what we were expecting to see, and here's where we think you can go with this. And it was really easy, or not easy, but there was a straightforward path for me to follow, because I had these examples that I could draw on, and then the recommendations of the reviewers pushing me in that direction. But yeah, I'd like to think that, you know, there was a nugget there that Joel saw, and I'm lucky that they gave me the chance. And then I would say maybe the one other thing that I learned through this, or one of the more important things I learned through this, I should say, is you know, interacting with reviewers in the decision letter. This was the first time where I was able to do that without co-authors coaching or input. And it was freeing. I felt like I was able to take a personal tone with them, rather than talking through a group. And I tried to be candid and be frank with them and be myself. And luckily, I think our personalities matched. I think it was a really collaborative process, and I enjoyed it, and I hope they did as well. But yeah, managing that review process, and I swear I did more work on the response documents than I did on the manuscript, round by round. But it was so enjoyable, I didn't mind. It truly felt like a collaborative process for that one. Yeah,
I mean, that's what we're striving for, but it's very hard to get to that point where you're actually, so as someone who's in the editorial seat, you're striving to try and create a conversation between the authors and the reviewers such that it becomes collaborative, the paper becomes better, everyone wins through the process. But it's not always possible. Sometimes there's too many flaws with the paper. Sometimes the reviewers just don't see what the authors see. But when you do start to get that, then it can be very generative. And so I'm glad that you got that experience, and I hope that you get the opportunity to recreate that experience from either side of the equation, either as a reviewer, absolutely, or as an author down the line, or potentially as an editor down the line.
Yeah, and to be transparent, I've had papers rejected from AMR as well. So I've never had a bad experience with the review process, but yeah, I understand completely. And in the case of those rejections, it was warranted for sure.
Yeah, and the only way because we all think we've got a great nugget of an idea. We all think we've seen something that no one else has seen. We all think there's a way to integrate literatures that haven't been integrated before. But the only way you really know is you put it down on paper, you put your best effort forward, you submit it, and all of us have had papers rejected. But by trying, you can see whether there is a conversation that you can enter that can get it to the point of what you've developed here. So well done. That's
well, thank you.
Talk to me a little bit about sort of where you think we can go next with this paper. So what are some of the opportunities it opens up for sort of next stage, either empirical testing or further theorizing, further exploration? What can we use this paper for as a jumping off point?
Yeah, so let me start on the theory side, and then I'll talk more on the more phenomenologically, because that I think is more aligned with kind of my prior and future research focus with crisis management. On the theory side, I really think that the dissimilar rivalry movement and competitive dynamics has endless and boundless potential. I mean, to look for instances like this where two actors who typically don't interact with one another engage with one another over some type of resource or something that they find valuable. I think there's boundless opportunities to try to understand that better, and it's a great way for management research and some of the theory that we have to contribute to outside disciplines. So I think Ted, yourself, Gideon Markman, I think you guys are kind of exploring that already and doing a good job there. In terms of crisis management and specifically kind of like media relations and with organizations, I think that I hope that this paper serves as a really good jumping off point to try to help us understand, I think, what are kind of like the problems with news media today. I don't mean to frame that too negatively, but I think that most polling suggests that trust in the news media is at an all-time low and declining. And that's really disheartening when talking about kind of like this key institution for our society, something that we need as the public to digest and understand events and all of that. So anyway, I think that one of my goals with this was trying to help reframe those relations between organizations and the media so that we as academics and also the public could better understand what might be driving these types of interactions. And I don't know that I've opened up that black box completely, and I don't think this framework provides all the answers, but I think it's a good start. It's the first to my knowledge that kind of like keys in on kind of these alternative reasons why media outlets might be engaging with organizations, especially when you're talking about kind of motivations for profit, or some type of any type of motivation that's outside of kind of like the journalistic norm of providing truthful information to the public. And so that's kind of my hope for it. And then in terms of some of the follow-up research that I'm doing is this is a big model. It's not something that could be tested empirically, which I think made it another great fit for AMR in terms of testing the entire model. But what I've been trying to do is pick off pieces of it and try to develop this theory further and extend it. And in fact, the shameless plug here, that AMJ that is in press currently is something that I think does that. It looks at organizational responses to their own misconduct and how they try to influence some of their stakeholders' perceptions about it. And it's funny, in that review process, we tried to really incorporate some of this narrative stuff and got a lot of pushback from reviewers on that the empirics didn't match the conceptualization, so we had to drop that. But that was kind of the original motivation for that there. And I think still it speaks to this phenomenon.
Yeah, and the thing it opened up for me was this sort of notion of narrative battles. So this is the other thing. When people read your paper, they're going to have different jumping off points. But for me, it opened up this idea that organizational leaders and anyone else trying to influence culture and society and perception will end up engaging in these narrative battles. And you conceptualize them at the sort of media organization level, but I think there's multiple other levels at which they're happening. There's obviously what's going on in politics. There are battles around climate change. There are you can go into any sort of domain and sort of start to see this rivalry over the narrative, and trying to claim the narrative as a resource and use it as a resource. And so I think just beginning to think about that, and it's become more and more pervasive as we've got more channels of media playing a role in public perception and culture. And so I think one of the interesting things that I find about writing an AMR paper is what other people key in on. And if it was me, that's what I would key in on. So
yeah, well, it's really funny that you say that, because I guess when you write a paper, you tend to see your theory everywhere, right? Anyway, that's definitely happened to me. I feel like I hear the term "control the narrative" everywhere. I see it everywhere. It's becoming an increasingly common phrase. I'm sure I could search the Google Trends on that and really find out whether that's accurate or not. But it's funny. Yeah, my wife and I are. When we sit and watch TV or whatever, and almost any time we see the term "control the narrative," I don't know if you're familiar with memes, but it's like Leonardo DiCaprio and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We're both like pointing at the TV, like, yes, there it is. It's I feel like my point is that what you're keying in on is definitely something that I see as well, all too frequently.
Yeah, and. So well done, and thank you for being willing to share your experience with us. Thank you for being willing to come on the podcast and share a little bit about your paper with us. And we look forward to continuing to work with you as an AMR author, as hopefully as an AMR reviewer, and just well done on a great paper.
Well, thank you, Greg. And as I mentioned before, I really enjoy the series. And I won't speak to looks, but you definitely got Rich beat on the voice. So the accent should win you some fans in the audience.